Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Let's talk a bit more about spadroons. Hey folks, so I've spoken quite a bit about spadroons. For a sword that I famously don't really like, I actually end up talking quite a bit about spadroons on my channel, and it's become a bit of a meme, I know that. But nevertheless, I thought I would really take this opportunity to show to you a beautiful example of a 1796 British infantry officer's spadroon, or sword, that was the line infantry's standard sidearm, for line infantry officers' standard sidearm, during the Napoleonic era from 1796 right the way through officially until 1822. And so therefore, you know, huge numbers of British officers carried these throughout the Napoleonic Wars. This was the typical infantry officer's sword at the Battle of Waterloo, for example. Now, why am I showing you this example specifically? I have shown you another example in the past. That's actually a sergeant's one, another one we own. It's actually Lucy's rather than mine. But the reason I'm showing you this one is this is an absolutely fantastic example of an officer's one with a blue and gilt blade. You can probably see there's something funky going on the blade. We'll look at that in a minute. And a gilded brass or bronze hilt. Now, let's start at the hilt end of the weapon. Why is this so special? Well, number one, these have always got brass or bronze hilts. Obviously, brass and bronze are copper alloys, so you take copper, you mix it with either tin or zinc, and sometimes both, sometimes other metals, to get what we call a copper alloy. So you have a copper alloy hilt that it consists essentially of 4 components on this. You've got the guard section, which is a large flat plate. Then the shell guard section, then you've got the knuckle bow guard section, which is this bit which comes around here, which is another element. Then you've got the pommel, and then you've got the grip. Okay, the grip of course inside is wood, and then it's wrapped with metal sheathing. I'll talk more about that in a second. So you've got a copper alloy hilt here with a wooden grip that's wrapped, and the copper alloy hilt, let's say bronze hilt probably, is gilded. Now, what does that mean? Well, quite simply, it means gold plated. Now, normally when you see these, they're not particularly gold coloured, they're usually brass coloured, and the reason is gilding rubs off, wears off fairly easily. This example actually has almost 100% of its gilding remaining. So you can actually see all of that, all of this surface all the way around, and all of the pommel and everything is all still gold. Essentially gold plated, and it's, you know, beautiful. I've had this professionally cleaned. It was quite dirty when it came to me, but I've had it professionally cleaned and it looks absolutely fantastic. No gilding was redone or anything like that. It's all original. Absolutely beautiful. Now the grip, this might look like to you, it might look like silver wire, and it is silver, but it's not wire. For some reason, and we don't exactly know why, they decided very often to make these as a sheath of sheet metal. So it's essentially a flat sheet of silver that is pushed or pressed, probably in some kind of stamp, into the shape of wire, such that, let's take my glove off and get this up focusing on the actual grip, such that you can see it looks absolutely like wire, but it is actually not. It's a flat sheet that's wrapped around, and then you can just just about, I think it's at the front, see a tiny line where the 2 edges of the sheet wrap around and meet. Amazing, amazing quality, amazing manufacture, and you know, likening these to types of jewellery and stuff is not too wide of the mark. So we've essentially got a gold-plated hilt, a silver grip that's made of a sheet of silver going all the way around, encasing the wood. And yes, indeed, the shape of the grip, the shape of the hilt rather, is very similar to a small sword. And that's really, you know, in terms of the use of these, we really should think about the spadroons of this era as militarized small swords. If you think about a small sword and you think, okay, I'm going to use it on a battlefield, but I'm going to use it against people who are going to be using bayonets against me, so bayonet attached to a musket, that's going to be a, you know, 9 or 10 pound weapon, a heavy weapon that's being thrust at me. So you need a weapon that's got some degree of mass in it, that's able to guard and parry a bit more easily. Or equally, people swinging things like sabres or cutlasses at you, so a cavalry sabre, or indeed another infantry officer using a sabre. If they're swinging a heavier sword at you, or indeed if you're somewhere else in the world and they're swinging a tulwar at you or something like this, then you want to be able to defend with a slightly more beefy blade, and small swords is more difficult when the blade is so light. So even if you're going to use the sword like a small sword, which is predominantly how these seem to have been used, then you still want a blade which has more mass in it. So what you shouldn't really think of is this is a cut and thrust blade. I would argue this is still essentially supposed to be a thrust-centric blade, but with the ability to parry heavier other swords or bayonets or whatever. So indeed it is quite a narrow blade, but it's still significantly wider than a small sword, for example. Now in terms of the point, you've got a spear point, so you can see the point is essentially like a dagger, it's double-edged. If we just cut the blade off at that point, we've got edge, edge and a symmetrical point. So in theory that should be good for penetration, should be good for thrusting. One of the design issues with the 1796 is it is quite a light and flexible blade. So you could argue that in a small sword context, where the 1796 falls down is the blade is too flexible. I'm not going to go on about the practical qualities of these swords very much in this video, because that's not what I'm really here to talk about. I'm really focusing on the decorative elements, okay, because I don't talk about those too much, and this is one of those swords where really the decorative elements are what I want you to pay attention to. So I'm just going to whip my glove off again, because the screen on my camera doesn't react if I'm wearing a glove for some reason. It only reacts when I've got an actual finger. It's like a touch screen. So we've seen the gilded hilt, we've seen the silver grip, made in very specific ways. Oh, one other thing I'll mention before we leave the hilt is this folding section here. So this is sometimes known as a fall down or a drop, and essentially it's a folding inner guard, and we do find that on later sabres as well. And why is it like that? Well, quite simply, to make it more comfortable to wear. So if you imagine it sitting against the side of the body, if you had a large shell guard, that's going to be very uncomfortable to wear and is going to keep bashing into you with that edge. Might even wear on the uniform. You see some complaints about swords wearing on uniforms. If you've got the fold down section, it's now flat and comfortable to wear. Now indeed, not all of these 1796 infantry officer sabres had a folding section. Some of them were solid. Pros and cons were quite simply that hinge section there is relatively weak, okay? So if you've got that folded out there and it takes a heavy blow from a sabre or a musket or whatever, there's a very good chance it will break, okay? So that hinge is a weak point. Equally, if you deploy the sword quickly, you might not have time to fold out the guard. So you might find that you're fighting someone and you've got no inner guard at all, really, because you haven't had time to fold down the inner guard. So they're the two main disadvantages I can think of. Obviously the advantage of the solid guard is that it's stronger. The disadvantage is it's more uncomfortable to wear in general. So some of these have solid, some of them have folding. I have to say most of the ones I've had have had folding guards, but funnily enough I do own another one, probably a sergeant's one, that is a solid guard. Now let's move on to the blade, and that's where this is something I don't think I've shown on my channel before, and this is a good example to show you of it. So I'm going to show you this side first. So you can probably see already, if I hold this close to my face, hopefully it will naturally focus quite well. Up here, the blade is shiny silver, okay? So this is steel colour, normal polished steel colour, and as I come down to here, you'll notice it goes blue. And it's blue all the way down to the base of the blade with gold bits all along. And this is what's known, I mean, many of you will know this anyway, but for those of you who don't, this is known as blue and gilt. And blue and gilt, it was incredibly popular in the Napoleonic period. It predates the Victorian habit of etching, for example. So in the Victorian era, and in fact just before, let's say from about William IV's time, arguably in George IV's time as well, etching was the standard way of decorating a sword blade. That's acid etching, essentially burning a design so that it's into relief into the blade. So it's almost like sculpting the surface of the metal. Whereas this is essentially painting it with chemicals. So most of you will know that if you heat up a piece of steel, it goes through a series of colours. Usually, in simplistic terms, it goes a straw colour, then it goes a blue colour, and then eventually it loses the colour and it starts to glow red. Now, when it glows red, that's usually the colour at which you can work the metal, you can hammer it. Equally, if you quench it, it will make it hard, this kind of thing. Okay, so you're getting a molecular change in the steel once it starts glowing. But before that, the blue surface that we get, which you'll notice gun barrels are often treated like that, has a property all of its own. Now, that blue colour is, to a degree, rust retardant. So I won't say it's rust proofing, it's not like stainless steel, but bluing helps to kind of stave off the effects of oxidization and rust. So that's why gun barrels are very often blued, because it means that the gun barrel is less prone to getting rust either on the surface, anywhere on the surface, either on the outside or on the inside of the gun barrel. And clearly that's a good thing. So guns are usually blued for practical reasons, but in this case, this is not really blued for a practical reason. This is blued because it looks freaking nice. And you'll notice if you look at an antique clock, for example, very often clock faces have steel hands, and very often those steel hands are blued, and they are blued because it looks nice. Okay, so you'll see it's almost an iridescent kind of, let's try and get the camera to focus on the blade rather than on what's behind me. There we go, hopefully. So I'll try and reflect the light off it like that. Can you see that bluish, it's really iridescent blue, beautiful colour. I find it extremely attractive, and you'll notice that the contrast between the blue and the yellow of the gilding. Now, the gilding on the blade is exactly really like the gilding on the hilt. It's applied in a slightly different way, but it's not only painted on there, the designs. So what's initially done with the blade is it's polished up and then it's engraved, hand engraved. That means scratched, essentially. Okay, so we've got scratched designs in here. And we've got various designs on this blade. We've got a, let's try and get it, there we go. That's a figure, a martial figure with a shield and a spear. And then we've got foliate designs. In fact, that's GR for George Rex just above there. Try and get it focused on the... So that's GR, and then there's a crown there, and then more foliate stuff up here. If we go down the blade here, there is, there we go, just there is a scroll, and in the scroll it says warranted. That means the blade's been tested for strength, for spring and hardness. So first of all they engrave, they scratch in designs, and then they blue the blade, and then they gild, and it's like a fantastic process that would cost a lot of money to replicate today. And I have to say, it's also not hugely durable. So a lot of these blue and gilt blades, simply the bluing and gilding, either one or the other or both, doesn't survive. The problem is, if this gets rust on it, the only way to get the rust off is to polish the blade. And if you polish the blade, it removes gilding and it removes the bluing. So to get a blade like this that has got some of the polished surface up here, then the bluing and the gilding down here over the engraving, is really something that's sought after. And you'll notice that these swords command a fairly hefty price as a result of that. And of course the period that they're from. For all we know, this sword could have been carried at the Battle of Waterloo. It's a very significant historic period that attracts a lot of collectors with a huge passionate degree of interest. So this could have been carried at any of those, it has been service sharpened, it could have been carried at any of those Napoleonic battles that we read about, in which the British Army was involved in the Peninsular War and obviously right the way through to Waterloo, and indeed the occupation of France after the Battle of Waterloo, which doesn't get studied an awful lot, but quite an interesting period in which we know from the accounts that sometimes British officers got into duels of honour with French officers, and in fact we find the Duke of Wellington, we find in his letters him recommending that they learn fencing from a fencing master just in case they have to have a duel, which is kind of interesting because he'd forbidden dueling, but behind the scenes he obviously he pretended to ban it, well he did ban it, but then behind the scenes he obviously wanted to say, well, if you do get into a duel, make sure you win. So anyway, there we go, a fantastic example of a British infantry officer's sidearm, in this case the 1796 spadroon, from the Napoleonic era, featuring the classic decorative elements that we often find on Napoleonic British swords, that being a gilded hilt, silver elements, in this case a grip covering, and blue and gilt. And if you want to see more examples of blue and gilt, indeed this sword will be going for sale on my website, so I'll be putting up good pictures if you want to see more pictures of this website, of this sword on my website. The link below to Eastern Antique Arms, where I sell my swords through, so you'll be able to see better photos of this sword there. And equally, if you just go onto Google Images and just search blue and gilt, or blue and gilt sword, you'll find dozens and dozens of beautiful images of these sorts of swords, and also sabres and naval swords which have blue and gilding on the blade, and I think it's one of the most attractive styles of decoration that's ever been devised for sword blades. Cheers folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.